Okay, today I said I would give a share on Pesach, but in reality, I'm going to do something really much wider than that. Pesach was an important event in the history of Klal Yisrael. So I'm going to discuss a little bit what that event was about, but I'm going to then jump to a much wider event. And I'm going to come out with a certain proposition. I'm going to say something which is really a very big chiddush, and will turn around the way we see things completely, basically. So I'm going to also look at the concept of the Torah and the concept of human history, where Pesach is only one part of it. Now, I've said many times that the essence of Pesach lies in one simple idea, the idea of guarantee. What do I mean by that? Well, it started off with Adam Rishon, the first man, with one mitzvah, and so on. And what we know is that Adam Rishon before the Chet was very different than all humanity after the Chet of Adam Rishon. In fact, it's considered a frame of reference for all of human history. So what are some of the features of that? And let me just review some of the features so that you have a certain clarity with this. Well, we know the concept that the Adam Rishon just can't take this. So Adam Rishon was only given one mitzvah. So the question that everyone asks is, really, how was it possible? I mean, what was the Torah before Matan Torah? What was the Torah? And because we didn't have Taryag mitzvahs, we didn't have the 630 mitzvahs, so it looks like we didn't even have the Torah. So how could the world be extant? How can it exist without the Torah? Because the prophet says, Im lo brisi yomam v'loila, were it not for my covenant day and night, which is the Torah, chukos shemayim v'oretz lo samti, I would never have created the world. So we see that it's impossible for the world to survive without Torah. And the world didn't have Torah before Matan Torah. That's when the world was given, that's when the Jewish people were basically given the Taryag mitzvahs and so on. And the answer is that the Taryag mitzvahs were really in different forms, different formats. The first format of the Taryag mitzvahs was a fusion. It was a fusion of all 630 commandments into one commandment. In other words, by doing one mitzvah, you actually were doing all 613, and so on and so forth. And why really is that? What's the number 613 Taryag that makes it so important? Well, according to the Kabbalah, the entire world is composed of 613 halakim or parts, components. The neshama of a person is composed of 613 also components or organs. The body is composed of 613 organs. What exactly that distribution is, I'm not going to go into, and so on. But basically, the number 613 refers to a structural component. It refers to the fact that the universe, all existence, all things which exist, the neshama of a person and the guf, the body of a person, are fundamentally, structurally composed of 613 parts. And it takes these 613 parts to have a tikkun of Nam Sufa. The problem of Nam Sufa, where the person feels that he is an entity important enough to vie with God, and therefore be some kind of a fragmentation of the unity of God, which causes Nam Sufa, is really can be fixed by 613 actions. And in those 613 actions lies free will. Any other action that the human performs does not have free will. It's called an isarusa de le'ela. It's called a energy, a force that comes from above. That means that everything that a person does in his life, even though he thinks that he's doing something out of free will, is really being done because in some way God is sending down a force or an energy into his consciousness that compels a person to do it. And in only 613 aspects or actions that a person does he actually have free will, where it's up to him what's being done. And that free will is called Isarusa de la Tata, an awakening from below, and so on. So this is very important. Only in the area of Taryag, 613 actions, and the 630 corresponding mitzvahs, does a person really exhibit behavior that in some way characterizes free will. That's extremely important. Everything else is an absolute illusion. So therefore, that's why there are 613 commandments, which have free will, to do the tikkun which a person requires before he enters into Olam Haba, the future world. So when Adam Rishon was created, how come he wasn't given 630 commandments? Well, the answer, he was. But these were the commandments in fusion. They were all combined into one mitzvah. And that was the mitzvah of kashrus, that you're not supposed to eat something. And God told them, you can't eat from the Eitz Hadas, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Only from the tree of life and the other trees in the Garden of Eden. So therefore, this was the status of the Torah at that time. So Adam Rishon did receive the Torah, but he received the Torah in terms of a fusion where all 613 components were fused into one mitzvah zone. So what exactly was supposed to happen? Was Adam Rishon supposed to go to Olam Haba alone? Well, fundamentally, yes. In other words, not only were all the mitzvahs fused into one mitzvah, but all of mankind was fused into Adam Rishon before the sin. That's right. Adam Rishon before the sin had an neshama which encompassed every soul that was made thereafter. All the souls of every Jew that was ever born, and even every non-Jew that was ever born. All of these souls being fused together constitute the soul of the first man, Adam Rishon. So therefore, would Adam Rishon have had children? Because are children not separate individuals? And the answer is no. In a certain sense, all the children that he would have had, and he would have had 2 sons, and then those 2 sons would have had 3 sons, and those 3 sons would have had 12 sons, and those 12 sons then would have had 70 sons, and 70 sons would have had 600,000. That would have been the progression of the children of Adam. And they would not have been independent children as such like they are today. They would have been on some level extensions of Adam Rishon. The chief soul in Olam Haba would have been one man, Adam Rishon, and his extensions. So therefore, this mitzvah of not to eat from the Eitz Hadas, you see, it was actually one mitzvah for Adam Rishon. It did not apply to his children. Why? Because they were considered extensions of Adam in the sense that they represented different midos or hanogas or supervisory characteristics. They would not have been truly independent of Adam Rishon, and they would have shared his Olam Haba. But fundamentally, Olam Haba would have been there for one man. You see it. Now, Adam Rishon had a very high madrega of ruchnis and gashmis. His physical body and his spiritual soul were basically connected, even though they were separated. You see it, and so on. But the important aspect of Adam Rishon before the sin, which is completely different than any aspect of after that, was fundamentally Adam Rishon was in a state called unguaranteed. His ability to get Olam Haba was not guaranteed. If he did a sin, he would have been annihilated, which is what the Midas Adin, the attribute of justice, would have demanded. So therefore, Adam Rishon did not have a guarantee that he would reach Olam Haba. And this was fundamentally his state. He had the potential and the possibility of reaching the future world, which is eternal. It's a world after, which is not based on time or space. The world of Shabbos. Adam Rishon was created on Friday after Friday, and therefore he had one day to do the mitzvahs. If he had done the mitzvah, that first Shabbos, the seventh day, would have been the beginning of Olam Haba. So therefore, human history would have been only one day long. That's it. That was the intention of God. But whether that would have happened depended on whether he would do the mitzvah. If he did not do the mitzvah and he did the sin, then the attribute of justice would have dominated and it would have annihilated the whole world. So therefore, God also introduced a new concept, the attribute of mercy. And by producing the attribute of mercy, God therefore saved the world because it was possible for Adam Rishon to overcome a sin. But still, it wasn't really guaranteed. Even though Adam Rishon could overcome a sin, there was the possibility of rehabilitation. In other words, even if Adam Rishon sins, it was possible for him to overcome the damage that sin produced. So the attribute of justice, therefore, does not allow you to overcome the sin, because once you unplug yourself from God, you are immediately annihilated. But what happened was the attribute of mercy was then introduced so that Adam Rishon was not annihilated, but he could overcome the sin by a rehabilitative act. But therefore, if he didn't do the rehabilitative act, or in some way the kapara, or the atonement of that sin didn't really work, then the whole world would have been annihilated. So therefore, the attribute of justice is not an act of guaranteed. It's an act of retribution where he could rehabilitate himself. But he was not guaranteed to receive the portion of the world to come. Now, after the sin, suddenly God said, now you are no longer alone. So in other words, your children will be your extensions, but I'm changing that program. In other words, you are the Zulasai. You are the fundamental recipient of Olam Haba. But I'm going to change the structure of the Zulasai so that you can live with your children even after the sin and so on. And how is that? That your children will no longer be extensions of you. They will actually be independent individuals that are derived from you. So your children will be derived other people, but they will not be extensions. And this is a very big difference between before the sin and after the sin. So therefore, we see that God therefore took the soul of Adam Rishon and fundamentally fragmented it into many different souls. So therefore, what was born after the sin was the concept of humanity, that humanity became a species. There was not one man with one mitzvah. There were now many people, humanity, the species of the human being, or the Zolosoi, as independent individuals, which now have 7 mitzvahs. So it was not one mitzvah, it was 7 mitzvahs. Well, the question is, why were there 7 mitzvahs given instead of 1? Because the one mitzvah of Adam Rishon dealt with his relationship with God. Since he had a problem of Naman Ksufa, since he felt disempowered because he had to share existence with God, that's called the Naman Ksufa, or the disempowerment, the feeling of shame and disempowerment with respect to God. But the fact is, now that Adam Rishon's children now become human beings independent of each other, the same feeling of disempowerment was now felt to other people. So now it had 2 sources. Disempowerment is not only felt to God, it was also felt to another human being. The fact that another human being existed beside yourself was a source of disempowerment for the person, because he was not the central person of the world. He now had to share the world with other people, and that perforce reduced his significance. So therefore, the person now had two different Namad Ksufas, one in reference to God and one in reference to other people. So therefore, a new category of mitzvahs were given. Before Adam Rishon had only one category of mitzvah, that was to correct the flaw between him and God, to declare the unity of God, to declare the fact that he would see God as a me-you relationship. Now he would say, God is not a me-you, but God is a me and inner me. I see God as really my foundation. And this would cure the problem of Namad Ksufa. But now this problem of Namad Ksufa also existed with other people. So he had to heal that as well. So therefore, the mitzvahs, the 7 mitzvahs that were given, and therefore these mitzvahs are called the mitzvahs of Noach, apply to God and to man. There are certain mitzvahs that apply to God, for example, to believe in God, and so on, and to not to curse God or anything like that, and to do certain mitzvahs that are obtained. You're not allowed to worship anything else but God. But there were also man mitzvahs of the 7 mitzvahs that refer to other people. Thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not murder, and so on. These mitzvahs now appeared in the relationship between man and man. So therefore, the 7 mitzvahs now became the tikkun of Namad Ksufa with 2 basic objects, God and man. But in this form, the relationship of ruchnius to gashmius, or physicality to spirituality, was still very high. In other words, ruchnius and gashmius were still connected at the core, even though they were separated, and therefore man had a Yetzer Hara, had an evil impulse, and a Yetzer Tov, a good impulse, one coming from the physical aspect of his being, and one coming from the spiritual aspect of his being, and these two are very closely knit together. But still, what did not exist was the guarantee that he could sin and that he had to be punished for the sin, in truth. In other words, there was the creation of Zohar before. The Midas HaRacham, or the attribute of justice, created Zohar, which was an identification in terms of a malach of the sin. So therefore, he would not be annihilated. But if in some way that was not accepted or not done, he would be annihilated. So the Midas HaRacham could only extend his existence, the existence of mankind, but it could not remove the possibility of annihilation yet. So therefore, mankind was unguaranteed when it comes to the providence to reside in Olam Haba. Now this continued with the Dor HaMabul, the generation of the flood, which were 10 generations between Adam Rishon and Cain and Havel. There were 10 generations that lived on after him, with Noach at the final generation. And those 10 generations were very high spiritually, even though they were unguaranteed in terms of Olam Haba. But those 10 generations were very evil, especially between man and man, because that was the first time that mankind experienced a Yetzer Hara between its relationship with other human beings. It was a very intense Yetzer Hara, and mankind sinned grievously in terms of his relationship with other people. There was a great deal of robbery and so on and so forth, a great deal of sin and so on between one man and another. And he could not sustain that, so God decided to destroy that whole generation, or really the 10th generation, which was the end of that. Now Noach was supposed to be the Mashiach, and when Noach was supposed to be Mashiach and bring the goal or the redemption to the 10 generations, but instead God annihilated the 10 generations with the Dor HaMabul, with the flood, and God decided to renew mankind with Noach being the new equivalent to Adam Rishon. So therefore, Noach was no longer a Mashiach. Noach was really the founder of mankind. And for the next 10 generations, which is called the Dor HaFloga, Noach actually became the founding principle of mankind. From him and his sons was born a new species of man. Now that generation of the 10 generations after the 10 generations of the flood was called the Dor Flogger. And in the end, they rebelled against God. They didn't rebel against each other. They had a good relationship with each other, but they rebelled against God. So therefore, what God did was he changed those 10 generations, but he did not annihilate them. Why? Because they were good to each other, they had peace among themselves. But since they rebelled against God, because they attempted to build a tower which would war against God, and this tower was not a tower, simply a vertical tower. This tower was a certain form of idol worship, where they thought that if they construct this kind of idol worship of a tower, it's called the Tower of Babel, that would make them, in a certain sense, able to compete with God. So this was a form of idol worship, and God decided, again, that mankind, or the Zelasai, was not the kind of species that he wanted. So after the first 10 generations, when mankind, with 7 mitzvahs, basically was completely fragmented in terms of themselves, and the second 10 generations, where he was fragmented with God, God decided to do something completely new. And instead of 7 mitzvahs, which simply covered the Namak Sufa of mankind and the Namak Sufa of God, God decided to add a new element that never existed before. He decided to create 2 different species, or 2 different concepts of mankind. And what was that? He decided to make one species of mankind who were the children of Abraham. Abraham, or Avram Avinu, would be the father of a new nation called the Yehudi, the Jewish people. And those people would be guaranteed their chelik in Olam Haba. In other words, how could God guarantee that they would get Olam Haba? Because he would give them the Torah itself. The Torah, which would be in the form of 613 commandments. In other words, never again would the commandments of the Torah be fused into 1 or into 7 mitzvahs. Now they would become completely individuated, composed of 613 in proportion to the 613 components of the soul. So with each mitzvah, the person would masaken, or correct, the defect in each part of a soul. And when the mitzvahs are divided into the 613 components of the soul and the body, that would then guarantee the Jewish people in terms of this. Now, how would this do this? Because if you look at the 630 commandments, you can see the process of guarantee. Why? Because the Torah of not of 1 mitzvah, not of 7 mitzvahs, the Torah, which is composed of 630 mitzvahs, which is the maximum amount of mitzvahs that the Torah can be composed of, is composed of 2 types of mitzvahs, what's called performance mitzvahs and what's called rehabilitation mitzvahs. Performance mitzvahs are those mitzvahs which earn you olam haba. They actually provide the possibility that you have a future eternal world beyond time and beyond space. That's called eternity. And what are the mitzvahs? Like the mitzvah of the mitzvahs of tefillin, or the mitzvah of mezuzah, or the mitzvah of thou shalt not steal, or thou shalt not murder, and so on. All of these mitzvahs, the 630 commandments, are called, of the 630 commandments, are called performance mitzvahs. And what they would do, they would gain you, or they will allow you to earn the future world. But then there are many other mitzvahs also that have nothing to do with earning the future world, but they have to do with guaranteeing that you would earn the future world, olam haba. How? Because fundamentally, the mechanism of these mitzvahs was what? Was to clear up the sins. They would allow you to rehabilitate, you see, according to the principles, the spiritual principles of the 630 mitzvahs. And what was those? Those are the mitzvahs that are associated with the temple. When you bring sacrifices, all the laws of sacrifices, which are gained in the Seder called Kochim, and all the laws of Tumah V'Tara that have to do with cleanliness and uncleanness, that have to do also with the sacrifices and other things and so on, these are all mitzvahs of rehabilitation. In other words, if a person never sins, then technically speaking, he doesn't have to bring a korban. So therefore, the categorization of these mitzvahs is not performance simply to do them, but they only should be done when people sin, because what they do is they annihilate the sin. They do not annihilate the zulasoi, the person, but they annihilate the sin. And this was never given in the form of mitzvahs before. And when these rehabilitation mitzvahs are given in the form of taryag, so therefore the person is able to acquire olam haba in a guaranteed level. So the truth of the matter is, the other Mauritian before the sin was Jewish. What is the definition of a Jew? Well, it's fundamentally the definition of a zulasoi. A zulasoi is a soul or a person with a body that in the performance of a mitzvah, which he does something, a certain action, which is called a mitzvah, by the will of God, then he earns the possibility of becoming eternal. Anyone who does a mitzvah and with that mitzvah he can earn the possibility of eternity, that person is called a Jew. That's the definition of a Jew. So according to that definition, Adam Mauritian was a Jew. And according to that definition, every person after the sin, all the people that were born in the 20 generations from Adam Mauritian until Avraham Avinu are all Jews. They're all Jews. So a Jew is anyone who has the spiritual power to earn, to transform existence from existence based on time to existence based on no time, which is concept of olam haba. Any person who has the spiritual ability to earn this new transformation of existence is called a Jew. So therefore, every person who was ever created until Avram was Jewish. But the difference is that they were not guaranteed. But when God gave Avraham Avinu the 630 mitzvahs, which are a direct result of this, of the completion of what's called the Shleimus Adam, he would not only be able to perform the mitzvahs, but he could rehabilitate himself even if he did sins. He had the possibility of rehabilitation and correction. So therefore, that left to a level of guarantee. And this guarantee is expressed in the sages of the Talmud when they say, Yisrael afa b'shechota, a Yisrael, who's a Jew with a guarantee, even though he sins, Yisrael who, he's still considered Jewish, which means he's still able to be, even though he sins, because since he can rehabilitate himself by certain mitzvahs in the Torah, which give him that power, he therefore will be guaranteed olam haba. That's an amazing thing. So what Avraham Avinu got, which no other Jew before him got, he became a Jew with a guarantee. And that's the definition of a Jew today. A Jew today is an individual who is guaranteed to get olam haba. Why? Because the fact that he has to observe 630 commandments. So this is what was given to Avraham Avinu. But even though it was given to Avraham Avinu, it was not given to him during the life of Avraham Avinu. This was actually given to him a couple of 100 years later. First, Avraham had two sons, Yitzchak and Yaakov. And then Yaakov, the third son of Avraham Avinu, was Yaakov, the third son. And he had 12 sons, each one becoming the head of a tribe. And then the tribes went into Egypt, and so on, because they had to undo the damage to the world that was done by the first 20 generations. In other words, even though God wanted to give Avraham Avinu the guarantee of getting olam haba, he could not simply do that. Why? Because the first 20 generations of mankind since Adam Mauritian, because of their sins, they actually damaged the possibility of getting olam haba. There was so much zoma in the world, you see, from the Midas Rachmam, that you could not build an olam haba. So therefore, God required, before the Jews can be guaranteed to get olam haba, that all this damage that was done by mankind for the first 20 generations since Adam Mauritian had to be corrected. Who had to correct it? Well, the one that God gave the guarantee, which is Avram. So therefore, God gave Avram Avinu 10 tests, and he gave tests to Yitzchak and Yaakov. And then he tested the sons, the 12 tribes. And from Avram Avinu until the Jews went into Egypt, They were all tested in a certain way. And why did they go into Egypt? They went into Egypt to clean up the damage that was done by the 20 generations of mankind before Avram Avinu. Yes, that's the reason why they went into Egypt in the first place, because that had to be corrected. In a certain sense, Olam Haba had to be cleaned up before you can go in terms of that new transformation of the soul. First, Olam Haba had to be corrected and spiritualized from sin of the 20 generations. So the Jews went into Egypt because Egypt became the vessel of the full damage that was accrued by mankind in those 20 generations. That's right. God took the damage that was done by those 20 generations and he put the whole Zoma of those 20 generations into the nation of Egypt. So Egypt became a vessel for the tumah, the uncleanliness, and so on and so forth, the imperfection of what? Of the damage of Olam Haba and Olam Hazeh from those 20 generations. And he told Avram that I'm going to put your people, your children, eventually into Egypt, and by keeping the mitzvahs, by not worshiping the idol worship of Egypt, they will therefore rectify the whole damage that was done by the first 20 generations. And that's why the Jews went into Egypt in the first place. Because Egypt was an evil nation. Why was it evil? Because the Medrash says that the man who had the idea to build the Dor HaFloga, the tower that would war against God, what was the name of that man who had that idea in the first place? And the name of that man was Mitzrayim, or Egypt. He was the founder of Egypt. You see it. And he was the one that came up with that idea. It was an idol worship that would attempt to dislodge God from ruling over the universe. Because man, because of the me-you relationship, that God was fundamentally just another you. And he can be removed and replaced. So they tried to replace him to Avodah Zorah. And that idea came up. The idea of that Avodah Zorah came up from the person called Mitzrayim, or Egypt. So that's why his children became the deposit of that evil damage that was done. So all the damage that was done by the 20 generations was placed in Egypt. That's what happened. So the Jews had to go in Egypt and rectify that by not worshiping the idols of Egypt. The Jewish people will then take the energy which now is stored in Egypt. It's the uncleanliness energy of what? Of Olam Haba, the Yemos Mashiach, and that energy would go to the Jews. So we see an amazing concept that the way the Jews deserved the guarantee of Olam Haba is that they would clean up the damage that was done to Olam Haba and to Olam Hazeh by the 20 generations after Adam Rishon. Which means that fundamentally the Bechor status, the firstborn status, which was the basic spiritual power of Olam Haba, would be transferred from the Egyptians who earned it because of the sorcery of Egypt. Egypt became the greatest nation of sorcery on earth. It said that when God gave out the power of sorcery to the world, 90% of that power was given to Egypt. And why did Egypt earn the information about sorcery, where the Egyptians could also do certain miracles? They earned it because of the tumah, the uncleanness of that damage. So when the Jews went into Egypt, they were supposed to say no to the idol worship of Egypt. And by saying no to the idol worship of Egypt, for a certain time, they would then restore the energy and take it away from the Egyptians. The spiritual energy of Olam Haba would then be removed from the Egyptians to the Jews. And then the Jews would suddenly obtain a new status called Azulosoi, who would be guaranteed right. So really the story of Pesach is a story of transfer. It's not a story that the Jews became Jews. Most Jews today have no idea what went on in the story of Pesach. But the fundamental idea in the story of Pesach would be that the Jews would earn Olam Haba because they would be the ones who would clean up Olam Haba and Olam Hazeh from the damage done to it. And in cleaning it up, they would take over. It would be transferred to them the power to be in Olam Haba on a guaranteed level. That's considered what a Jew is today. A Jew fundamentally is a person who, when he does certain mitzvahs, guarantees his position in the future world. And that's what Chazal mean. Yisrael, Alpha B'Shechota, Yisrael, he still remains a Jew even though he sins, because the performance of the patriarch mitzvahs, performance of mitzvahs, and rehabilitation of the mitzvahs would eliminate all the sins that he does. And finally, in certain ways, by the rehabilitative process, either in this world or in the world of the spiritual world, in Gehenna, he would then be able to earn Olam Haba. So that's the fundamental story of Pesach. So the Jew now is a different entity. He's an entity of guarantee of eternity by performing performance mitzvahs and rehabilitation mitzvahs. So what happened for the rest of human history? What happened after the story of Pesach? That's what we want to know. Did the Jews were they able to perform the 630 commandments? Well, sadly, the answer is no. And this is shocking. In other words, the Jews were able to perform it up to a certain time. And then what happened? What happened then? The Jews went into exile, into Babylonia. And they returned to Israel, and they went into a second exile, which is what? Persia. And they returned. And then they went to a third exile, where the Beis HaMikdash is destroyed, or so on and so forth, on some level, and then they have to go out of Israel. So the Jews had three fundamental exiles: Babylonia, Persia, and Greece. In two of them, they actually left. They were outside of Israel, and they had no Beis HaMikdash. And the third exile, they were actually in Israel, and they had the Beis HaMikdash, but it was considered an exile because their status, spiritual status, was extremely low. So therefore, the Jews experienced the concept of exile, where they no longer had the Torah, and they no longer had Eretz Yisrael, and they had the Torah, but they no longer had what? They no longer had a Beis HaMikdash, and they no longer had the concept of Eretz Yisrael. So they were said to be in Golus, and they lost hundreds and hundreds of mitzvahs that were rehabilitative. That's right. So finally, in the last exile, which is the exile of Sodom, the exile of Edom or Esav, they finally went into a permanent Golus. That's right. They never went back to the land of Israel until the Yemosha Mashiach, or right before. They were outside of the land of Israel fundamentally, and also they were missing all these mitzvahs that had to do with the land of Israel, and they had no Beis HaMikdash. So we see that the Jews throughout the history have sustained many different levels. So the question is, how do we look at this? Well, what we look at is what happens. We say that the Torah in the form of Torah mitzvahs has been depleted. They started out with 630 mitzvahs so that they can do a full job of guarantee, and then they started to lose it. They started to lose it, right, when there was an exile and they left the land of Israel, so they lost that, and they lost the Beis HaMikdash. So fundamentally, all of human history for the Jews, as far as the Jews are concerned, is a depletion of the 630 commandments. So the question is, if that's true, if there's a depletion and they're losing hundreds and hundreds of mitzvahs, now we have maybe 200 mitzvahs left? So we've lost 300 to 400 mitzvahs. How could the Jews now be guaranteed the Olam Haba? That's the question. How could the Jews be guaranteed Olam Haba since they no longer have 630 mitzvahs? That's the central question to which we have to ask. You know, they lost the mechanism of guarantee. And this is the fundamentally very powerful question. It's come out the most important question of Jews today. It's the most important question in Jewish history. Because the sense of depletion started where? It started with the Chet of the Egel. When the Jews were in the desert, they worshipped the golden calf. And that's when it started. And from there, it's been downhill ever since. So we have to ask ourselves, what happened to them? What happened to the guarantee? What happened to that special status, which Chazal said to them, that they have a guarantee to get Olam Haba, which other Mauritian and the 20 generations after them did not have. Even though there was the midas haracham, the attribute of mercy, they did not have the guarantee. So the fundamental question is, what happened to the Jewish people after that? Now, I've never really seen anyone speak about this concept and so on. But this concept is the most obvious concept as far as we're concerned. The Jewish people have been changing in their spiritual status. In fact, the spiritual status of the Jews changed when what? In the year 400 BCE by the story of Purim. There was a major change of the Jewish people and a major change of humanity at that time. What do I mean? Because until 400 BC, from the time of Adam Rishon, after the Chet, until 400 BCE, which is what? Which is several thousand years, there was the status of what's called direct access. In other words, the fundamental theme of mankind at that time was a tremendous proximity to spirituality. The chief people at that time, before the story of Purim, was the person called a prophet. What is a prophet? A prophet is somebody who suddenly goes into a trance, at least everyone except for Moshe. But all of them went into a trance, and in that trance, they approached the situation of death. But suddenly, their soul was able to connect to the spiritual universe, and they were able to receive information from the prophetic experience. And then when they woke up, they remembered the experience, and they understood what it meant. So that means that fundamentally, the Jews, until the story of Purim, were still able to communicate with God. They had the ability to leave their body in their soul and enter the spiritual universe, right? And understand certain concepts and truths and mysteries from God himself. And this was called a prophet. Not only were there prophets, there were people who worship idols. And they had spiritual powers too, which we do not understand. Idol worshippers were not people who simply worship stones and bricks and wood. They did not worship inanimate objects. So then what is idol worship? Idol worship is the worship of the astrological, the planets and the stars. Because the people believed that these somehow were representatives or agents of God who himself abandoned the world. And he put his power into the power of the planets. And that's the study of astrology. It is. In fact, it says in the Kabbalah that God brings down the spiritual powers to the world, or the power of the spheres, through the mazolos, through the stars and the planets. How he does that, we don't know. We don't understand it. But the reason why there's so many different stars and galaxies in the universe, because there are that number of energies that come down to the world. What happens to a person is composed of 1 million points of energy that comes into that person for the rest of his life. Each energy has a specific star in the universe that's related to it and gives that to him. How it does it, we have no idea. But astrology is directly connected to astronomy. That's why astrology is when people configure the relationship of the stars and planets to each other, they can actually determine on some gross level what the energy is of that. They can see something about what will happen to the person and what his personality is. And that's the worship of the Zohar, because they believe that this energy comes from God, but that God gave up this energy and abandoned it. God abandoned the universe of man, and he said, you're on your own. And instead, he gave this power over to the stars. That's why Avodah Zorah, or idol worship, is called Avodah Kochov Mazolos, the worship of stars and planets. That's right. So therefore, what these idol worshippers used to do is make an image or a replica of a model that represents the star of planets. For example, the planet Mars is a planet which has the energy of war and the energy of conflict. In some way, the energy that relates to the planet Mars, and we have no idea how this works, but relates to the concept of conflict and war and disagreements. And therefore, if you create a certain vision of Mars, a certain image, and a certain idol, however they represented Mars, you would therefore be able to create a vehicle, a receiver, an antenna, which can pick up this energy of Mars and transfer it to the idol itself. And once you give it that and you sacrifice a korban, a sacrifice to this image of Mars, you can actually control this energy. That's right. That's what idol worship is. It's nothing more than the ability to control the energies that come from heaven through its vehicle transmission through the stars, by making a model of the stars, a replica of the stars, and then worshiping the model by sacrificing an animal to that star or to that planet. And then you would suddenly gain domination or control of that energy of Mars. So therefore, it was something. Now, we don't have this chokhmah anymore. We have no idea how to do it. When astronomers study the universe, they study the composition and structure of the stars and planets. But they have no idea of the spiritual background of the stars and planets and what they do. But the stars and planets of the universe, the fact that there are 2 trillion galaxies and 100 billion stars in each galaxy, are simply that many types of energies that come to every human being in history and determine his life cycle. That's the way that the human being gets his energy throughout his life. In some way, we no longer have this wisdom. But this wisdom was known to idol worshippers in the beginning, and it actually provided them real energy. That's why Egypt was the greatest nation on earth at that time. Why? Biblically, Egypt was the greatest nation on earth and contained the whole power of the damage of the spiritual universe in it. So the Jews would have to clean it up. But why was it the greatest nation on earth? Because it knew exactly how to do the astrology and how to access itself to this energy. And possibly that's how they built their pyramids, which are really impossible to build. So therefore, we have a whole different understanding of what ancient Egypt was. So this chokhmah, this wisdom, disappeared. The prophets and the sorcerers, what's called prophets and machashvim. A novi is a prophet, and a machashav is a sorcerer. These were the two people who were the chief people at the time in human history before the 4th century BCE. The 4th. Because at that time, they had direct access to spirituality. But after the story of Purim, this access changed, and it was called indirect access. The prophet and the sorcerer disappeared from human history, and what came instead of them, what represented them and substituted for them, was now the philosopher and the scientist. Before there used to be what? There used to be a prophet, and this now became a scientist and a philosopher. Before then, there was a sorcerer, and the world was filled with these people, the Jews. The Gemara says that at the time of direct access, at the time when there were prophets, do you know how many prophets there really were? Even though we only have 24 books in the Torah, of 24 Nevi'im, but the truth is that there were over 1 million people, Jews, who were actual Nevi'im. But the reason why we don't know who they were, because they had nothing to say for the future generations. Their prophecy told them the mysteries of the wisdom of the spiritual universe. So therefore, they never wrote any books. The only books that we have that relate to the rest of history of mankind for human history was only the 24. That's why we only have 24 books of prophets. So therefore, that world after the story of Purim in the 4th century BCE now had indirect access. That was the beginning of Greek wisdom. The philosophers and the scientists, Archimedes and so on and so forth, and Thales of Miletus, and the great philosophers, the Greek philosophers of Aristotle and Plato and Socrates, they were born in the 4th, 3rd, and 2nd century BCE. And why? Because that's when philosophy and science started to replace the concept of direct access, which was the prophet and the sorcerer. So therefore, we see that mankind shifted in a major way throughout its history. So what is the relationship of the shift in the Torah? We see that something is happening to the Torah, that as we go on in human history, from the time of Matan Torah, the receiving of Torah, till now, we see that's been a tremendous depletion in the Torah in terms of the amount of mitzvahs that we do. So that looks like an absence. That Torah is depleted, and therefore the Torah is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. There's an absence. So the question is, and it changes the nature of mankind. Because as the Torah becomes depleted, the spiritual nature of mankind is lost. Whereas first mankind were a prophet, no longer. Now he's a philosopher, he's a scientist, he's an intellect. He doesn't know things from his soul, he knows things from his brain, from his mind. And before that, there was a Machashav, a sorcerer, who can actually do things. We know that because the ancient Egyptians were sorcerers. When Moshe Rabbeinu threw down his staff and it suddenly became a snake, right? What happened with the Egyptians? Well, they also threw down their staves. And what did their staves become? It became what? A serpent. Well, wait a minute. I understand how Moshe Rabbeinu turned his staff into a snake. He had the power of God. But how does the Egyptians, who are basically worship idols, how were they able to do it also? How could they turn their staffs into snakes? And this was a living snake. And the answer is, they knew how to do this. They had the sorcery knowledge that made them capable. They didn't do this because they had the knowledge from Moshe Rabbeinu. They had the knowledge because they had tremendous understanding of the powers of spiritual sorcery. So therefore we see mankind was in a completely different level, but mankind lost that power entirely at the story of Purim. That's why in the Megillah Esther, there's no mention of the name of God at all. The whole miracle is hidden. God is hidden. You know, no longer will you have direct access to spirituality. But in any sense, we see this has to do with the depletion of the Torah, because the Jews were about to go into permanent Golus. And we were supposed to lose the Beis HaMikdash for good. We were almost about to lose the second Beis HaMikdash. And therefore, we were all supposed to go out of what? We were supposed to go out of Israel. So the Jews were heading to a new Golus that would be permanent. It wouldn't be temporary Goluses, the 3 exiles before. It would become permanent. So therefore, the Torah was being more and more depleted, more and more fragmented. And that means that the soul of mankind was about to be reduced again and again and again. So the fundamental question is there. How could the Jews receive Olam Haba on a guaranteed level when the Torah is literally working its way out of existence? That's the most powerful question that has to be asked of Klal Yisrael. So what is the power? What is the possible answer? So I want to give you what I consider the answer to this question in basic principles. I cannot go into this in detail, but I will give a certain detail level of what the answer to that question is. Because the Jewish people have been going down in their spiritual status from Matan Torah, from the time that they received the Torah, until now, completely downhill. So the question is, what is happening? So therefore, I'd like to come up with a new definition of Torah. Torah does not mean that you have to keep 630 commandments. That's not true. You don't. But that Torah has what's called versions. There are versions of Torah. They actually are. And it doesn't mean that there are depleted versions of Torah, although it looks like that. So a Torah of 630 commandments is simply called the perfect Torah. It has the complete ability to guarantee you, because it gives you the power of performance mitzvahs and rehabilitation mitzvahs. But even a Torah of less than 630, even a Torah, let's say, of 300 or 200 mitzvahs, even a Torah which is based on the absence of what? Of Eretz Yisrael and the absence of the temple is also a Torah. In other words, there are different versions of Torah. Each version has a certain power. That's right. And it doesn't have to have that power because it's 630 mitzvahs. Then it's perfect. But it still has a power to guarantee Olam Haba. But that power now is commensurate with the soul. In other words, what's really decreasing in human history is the soul of mankind. Every individual who lived at the time of the Mauritian, or lived at the time of the 20 generations, was much higher than all those people who lived at the time of Avraham Avinu, which again were much higher than souls which lived by the time of the Toldos, or these 12 tribes. And this is what we see, that as human history proceeds on and on and on until the souls of mankind, the souls of each generation of men become much smaller, much less spiritual. So therefore, what's required to give them Olam Haba, which is called earning Olam Haba, the future world, and what's required to guarantee that Olam Haba is completely different for each generation. So it's not that the Torah is being depleted. It's being depleted from its perfect state, but it's not being depleted from the name of Torah. It still has the same power as that the Torah of all the generations, except that it's being applied to a different level of soul. So therefore we see that the Zulasa himself, the one who's supposed to go to Olam Haba, is being depleted. That's what's really being depleted, not the Torah. The soul of the people in each generation is going down and down and down, characterized, for example, that we see that the soul of people in biblical times, before the story of Purim, were much greater than the soul of people post-biblical, in the time of the Talmud and at the time of the current 2,000 years, because we see that the number of mitzvahs is getting less and less. So the souls are being depleted. Because the souls are being depleted, the Torah that is able to earn and guarantee Olam Haba becomes less and less. That's right. And therefore, what I will go down and I will show you that there are 8 versions of Torah. That's right. There's not one version of Torah called 630 mitzvahs and depleted versions of Torah. No, there are 8 separate versions of Torah, each one having the ability to allow a Jew to earn Olam Haba and to be guaranteed that he would earn it. That's right. Each version or level of Torah and so on. So what the Midas HaRachamim did, and what God said to Moshe Rabbeinu when he forgave the Jewish people for the sin of the golden calf, he said to Moshe Rabbeinu, Solachti kidvoracha, I will forgive the Jews for the sin of the golden calf, but I will forgive them in a way which is even much greater than what you prayed, because you prayed that I should forgive them for the sin of the golden calf. But in order to do that, I have to create a new concept of Torah. I have to create a new version which will be applicable on each level. And therefore, I will from now on save the Jews on every level that they go to. And that's 8 different levels. And I will save the Jews on each level of this with the Torah that's applicable and germane to that level. So he said to Moshe Rabbeinu, Solachti kidorecha, I will forgive them, I will and save them as you have requested me. Because fundamentally in your request, you're not only simply saying, I should forgive the Jews because of the sin of the golden calf, but you're saying, just like I forgive them for the sin of the golden calf, I will forgive them to the end of time, and they will always retain the ability to earn Olam Haba and to have that earning as a guaranteed process. Right. That's astounding. And God said, how will he do that? You can't do that because there's no longer any 613 mitzvahs. So how does God do it? Because God told Moshe Rabbeinu, my attribute of mercy is now expanded to 13 levels. When the Torah says that the name of God is Keil Racham V'Chanan, Erech Apayim U'Gdol Chesed, and so on, the 13 tells in the name of God, God says to Moshe Rabbeinu his name, and his name contains 13 basic concepts, and each one is a different level, a different attribute of the power of mercy, so that it can save Klal Yisrael, not only in terms of the way they earn Olam Haba, but in the way they're guaranteed. That's right. That became applicable at Matan Torah, and became applicable at the Chet of the Exile, the 13 attributes of what the Banishim does. So the question now really is, if this is true, that there are 8 different versions of Torah, because God has saved Klal Yisrael in 8 different ways, what are these ways? Okay, we're going to start to go through these ways. So for the rest of the year, I'm going to discuss the 8 different versions of Torah, each one having the capacity to save, to earn and save those souls guaranteed at that level of neshama that corresponds to all of the generations of the Jews in human history. And not only Jews, but it also corresponds to the Goyim. Also, even the Goyim, what's called a Nochri, a Goy, also has an aspect that is connected to that. And I'll explain that at a different time. So the first aspect is the Torah that was given to Adam Rishon. What was that? It was the Torah of one mitzvah. That one mitzvah encompassed, consolidated all 613. But it did not, in that form, it could not guarantee it. Why? And that's the question. Why were the holiest souls of the Jewish people, the holiest Jews were the Jews at the beginning of time, Adam Rishon, the greatest Jew of all time. And then the 20 generations, the generations of the flood, and the generations of the Tower of Babel, the Dor HaFloga, and the generations of the Ovis. Why were these generations the greatest people of all time? Because spirituality and physicality were actually connected much higher. With Adam Rishon, before the sin, it was basically completely connected with a slight difference between the body and the soul. And it was the soul and the body of Adam Rishon, which had the Yetzer and the Yetzer Tov, were only slightly disconnected. So therefore, Adam Rishon, for all practical purposes, before the sin, was like an angel. He was almost as great as an angel. But since he had a body, he had Gashmias, therefore he had a Yetzer Hara. And therefore, he can jeopardize his ability to go to Olam Haba. And then the next generations, with the people, the 10 generations after Adam, or after Adam sinned, it was different. They went down a level, but they were an incredible level. How do I know that they were incredible? Because they were supposed to bring the Mashiach. That's right. Noach was supposed to be the Mashiach. You see, the Torah doesn't say this actually. But it becomes really obvious when you think of it. Why? How do we know that the 10 generations after Adam Rishon were actually so high that they were supposed to themselves witness the Yemos Mashiach? How do we know? Because we know this from the way they died by water. Because the question is, why did God kill them all by a flood? He had to make the world like a bathtub where he raised the water level so high that it was almost equivalent to the mountains. Well, you know how much water that is? You know how much water the oceans suddenly have to contain in order to raise the level of water so high that it's up as high as the mountain, right? So the world became like a bathtub. Why did God do it? That was a miracle. Because the answer is, the way they died, those people of the 10 generations, they died by the light of Mashiach. Because the Pasuk says in Yeshaya, Umola Deis Hashem, and the world shall be filled with the knowledge of God at the time of the Mashiach, Kamayim Liyom Mechasem, like the waters cover the sea. So we see that the light of the Mashiach is compared to water. That's right. It's compared to the waters of the sea. So how do those people die? Well, those people were killed by a flood that was so high that it actually was equivalent to the light of Mashiach. That's right. The people of the flood died from the light of Mashiach. Right. Why? Because they were worthy. They should have received the Mashiach himself, who was Noach. But they didn't because of their sins. So therefore, we see that generation after Adam Rishon was a spectacular generation, but their sins were very grievous, especially between man and man. So that's what we see. So therefore, what does it mean that a whole generation is totally killed off from the light of Mashiach itself? So instead of the light of Mashiach bringing them all closer to God, it destroyed them. But they died from the Messianic period. They died in the Messianic period. When God destroyed the world by a flood, he destroyed the world because suddenly the world entered the Messianic period. It was the Emoisa Mashiach. That's right. They experienced the Emoisa Mashiach, but instead of experiencing it as a light, as an elevation of consciousness, they experienced it as water. And therefore, they died. So you understand? What killed them was the Emoisa Mashiach itself. But instead of Noach becoming the Mashiach, he would become the progenitor, the father of all mankind after Adam Rishon, the second father of mankind. So what about his generation, the Dvar Flogger? Well, his generation was also very high. Because in his generation, what happened that never happened before, his generation was divided into 70 madregas or levels of spirituality. Before that, you didn't see that division. All of mankind was at one level, so they all died. But after him, in the second 20 generations, in the 10 generations after Noach, mankind divided itself spiritually on 70 different levels. That's right. And their names are recorded in the Torah. But each name was recorded because it represented a new level. So therefore, we see that mankind was suddenly divided spiritually, which means originally he was on one level, but then he was divided spiritually on the second 10 generations. And the last one, the 71st nation, was Avram Avinu. And God said to Abraham, I see all the levels are not good enough for Olam Haba. That's what I see somehow. And mankind is not guaranteed. But through you, I will guarantee mankind, not to them. Because God said to Abraham, and through you, in you will be blessed all the nations of the world who do not have a guarantee. And you are the one I will give a guarantee. But you first have to go into Egypt and clean up the world. You have to remove the Zoyam of Nabiya and let the Shechina out from the imprisonment of Zoyama. Right, so he said that to Avram, because Avram Avinu was the 71st level or the 70th, I'm not sure. He was the highest level of spirituality of mankind. So therefore, he was the only one, him and his children, that would be able to have a guarantee. And with that guarantee, he would be a blessing to all of mankind, because through him, through their connection to him, they would be able to be Zoichet Olam Haba. That's right. So he gave Avram Avinu and his sons Yitzchak and Yaakov, therefore, a new version of Torah. So look, how many versions do we have? We have the version of Torah of Adam Rishon, the one mitzvah as against Torah 6:13. The second version was the version that was given to what? To the 10 generations after Adam Rishon. And that second version was also given, what? To the 10 generations after those 10 generations. And those versions, the three versions, Adam Rishon before the sin, Adam Rishon after the sin, and the 10 generations of the of the Tower of Babel. These versions was not able to give mankind, even though they were Jews and they had the ability to create Olam Haba, they could not earn the guarantee. So the third version he gave to Avram Avinu, and from Avram Avinu up to Matan Torah, from Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov who were tested, and then the 12 tribes were tested, and they went into Egypt so that you should defy the worship of idols. To those people, the God gave another version, and that was called the version of an Ein Mitzvah. An Ein Mitzvah, that it's a version of Torah where you're not commanded the 613 commandments. God never commanded the 613 Taryag mitzvahs to the Jewish people from Avram Avinu until Matan Torah. So that version of Torah is called Eina Mitzvah, non-commandment, but it still had the possibility of giving them a guarantee. How do I know that? Because when Moshe Rabbeinu prayed to God that by Matan Torah the Jews worshipped the golden calf, so Moshe Rabbeinu did not know if the Torah that they had in Egypt was a non-commandment form of the Torah, but it was still Taryag mitzvahs. The Jews fundamentally kept as many of those Taryag mitzvahs as they could, and so on. Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov kept the Taryag mitzvahs because Yaakov Avinu said to Lavan, Im Lavan galti v'Taryag mitzvahs shemati. Even though I lived with Lavan and I was not commanded the Taryag mitzvahs yet, because that would only be by Matan Torah, which is a couple hundred years later. But he said, but I still kept the 630 mitzvahs. Why? Because even though it's not commanded, I still have to keep it because I am a patriarch. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov were the overs, because they gave the ability of the 613 commandments to be given to Klal Yisrael. So in a certain way, it was a kind of a border. It was between commanded and not commanded. But Moshe Rabbeinu at Matan Torah, when the Jews worshipped the golden calf, he wasn't sure what the madrega of those mitzvahs were. Why? Because these mitzvahs were not commanded in Klal Yisrael. So Moshe Rabbeinu did not know that they have the ability to give Klal Yisrael a guarantee, and if they did, then the Rebbeinu Shem could forgive Klal Yisrael, in a certain sense, for worshiping the golden calf. But if they did not earn the ability of guaranteed, then he couldn't save the Jews. So he didn't know what was the status of the commandments that were given to the Ovos, which Klal Yisrael had while they were in Egypt. Did they have the status of a guarantee or not? But God said to him, Hanichali, let me be so I can destroy them. So God told them they had the status of a guarantee. Even though they were pre-Matan Torah, they were before Matan Torah, and they were not actually told the Klal Yisrael as commanded by God, but they still had the capacity, because the mitzvahs, as they were performed by Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, was so powerful that Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, in performing these mitzvahs, were able to instill in them the power of guarantee, even though they were yet not commanded. And Moshe suddenly realized that he can save the Jews. Not only was he able to save the Jews, but he was able to save the Jews for all of mankind. Because God said, not only will I save the Jews from the golden calf, but I will save all the Jews for the rest of human history. Because forever, the Torah will be in a version where it will be able to give a guarantee. It will be in a version of 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. It will be in all those versions. And they will all have the ability to save mankind. That was the power of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. When they did these mitzvahs, they actually instilled into the universe, into the physical world, that forever there would be this guarantee. That's how powerful the performance of the mitzvahs by Avram and Yitzchak and Yaakov. You have to understand what's going on here. And then finally, God gave the Torah on Mount Sinai. Now, he already gave the Torah before to Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. No, he didn't, and he did. Because the question is this: why did Moshe Rabbeinu have to go up to the mountain Sinai to receive the Torah, right? He received the 613 commandments from Mount Sinai and onward. Why did he have to gain it by his nevuah, which was unique? In order for Moshe Rabbeinu to receive the energy of the Torah, of the Taryag mitzvahs, he had to be the greatest prophet of all, where he never went into a trance. He can talk to God face to face, awake. He needed that level of prophecy to be able to get the Torah, which would guarantee truthfully all of Klal Yisrael for the rest of human history. Why? But it says that Avraham Avinu knew the Torah. He knew the 630 commandments. So we see that Avraham Avinu was able to receive the Torah without that level of prophecy. Same thing with Yitzchak, same thing with Yaakov. They were able to do it. So that means that the Torah was admissible, was applicable, was knowable even before. So what was the difference between Avraham Avinu doing the Torah and Moshe Rabbeinu giving the Torah? What was the difference? There was a big difference. Because even though Avraham Avinu knew the Torah, he knew the Torah. How did he know it? Because he didn't know that. It wasn't that he knew the mitzvahs. He was a scholar. He knew the Yetzer Hara. In other words, he knew that since the 630 commandments was an antidote to the Yetzer Hara, to the evil inclination on 613 different levels of action, he knew exactly the manifestation of the evil impulse. And from knowing the manifestation of the evil impulse, he was able to calculate what the mitzvah would be that's required to be an antidote. So in other words, he knew it indirectly. He knew the Torah from the Yetzer Hara by studying the manifestation of the Yetzer Hara, and maybe he knew that through his nevuah. He understood what the mitzvah probably was that was the antidote to that, because the free will of mankind only exists in the Torah, in the 613 actions. But Moshe Rabbeinu knew that. He knew the mitzvahs as they existed unto themselves, not from the Yetzer Hara. So Moshe Rabbeinu knew the internal, intrinsic depth of the Torah. That's something that Avraham Avinu did not know. In a certain sense, he knew it indirectly. And he was able to calculate all 613, even the mitzvahs of Rabbanon. But he did not know the Torah intrinsically. He did not have that level of nevuah. Only Moshe Rabbeinu would get that level through the nevuah of Matan Torah. When Moshe Rabbeinu went up to the mountain to receive the Torah, he would receive the Torah from a totally different level, and suddenly he would not simply know the 630 commandments from the Chetzonius, from the outside, externally like Avraham Avinu. He would know it internally from the necessitation of the consciousness, from the essence of the soul. So that tells us that the Torah that was given on Matan Torah, which is the holiday of Shavuos, is not like the Torah that we are given, right? What is the Torah? That's the Torah of the Amos HaMashiach. That's right. What Moshe Rabbeinu was supposed to receive was not the Torah that we have, which was given on Yom Kippur, after God forgave us. But the original Torah given on Sinai was the Torah of the Luchos Rishonos, the first tablets, which were broken by Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu broke that tablets, but those tablets contained the light of Mashiach, which contains the information intrinsically of the Torah down to the ultimate level of understanding. And that's why Moshe wanted that Torah. Why? Why did Moshe Rabbeinu do that? Because he already knew the Torah from Avraham Avinu. But he wanted that Torah because he did not understand the panemius of the Torah, which is the light of Mashiach. It's called the Nun Sharei Bina. The 49th level is the Torah from this external point. But from the internal point, it's the 50th level. And that was never given over to mankind. It was supposed to be given on the 50th level, which is the light of Mashiach. And even though Moshe Rabbeinu was the greatest Navi of all time, he did not have through his Nevuah the light of Mashiach. He was not the Mashiach. When he died, he was only at the 49th level, because when the Jews worshipped the golden calf, they lost that light. They did not get the 50th gate. So Moshe Rabbeinu broke the tablets and kept the tablets. So potentially, we have that with us, but not on an open level. Where do we have it? We have it in the second Luchos. The light of Mashiach, which is the 50th gate, is contained within the 49 gates of the Torah, the second tablets that we're given. Moshe Rabbeinu was given two tablets, two sets of tablets. The first level on Shavuos, which is the 50th gate, the light of Mashiach itself, which is the internal understanding of what that is, to the external level. When the Jews lost that light, they gained the second tablets, which is given on Yom Kippur, which is a symbol of forgiveness and rehabilitation. God forgave them and gave them the Torah itself. But the second tablets, which we have today, those that are called the 5 books of Moses, is really the light of Chitzonius and Panemius. It's what we see is the light of Torah at the outside. We cannot see the inside, but the inside is contained in the outside. That never existed before. It was unavailable. The light of Avraham Avinu was only the Torah from the outside, not the Torah from the inside. Moshe was supposed to receive the light from the inside of Mount Torah. The Jews lost that by the Chet of the Egel, the sin of the golden calf. So therefore, what Moshe received when he went up to the mountain the second time, he received that light, the inner light, the 50th gate, but only as it's hidden in the 49th level. So it's a double combination. It's a combination of the light of Mashiach on the inside and the light from Avraham Avinu on the outside. So we are still missing that light. And the Mashiach at the end of time, he is the only one that will be able to see that light on the inside. How? He will not have to go up to the mountain again. There is no second Matan Torah. There's no second giving of the Torah. But he will be able to see it because he will be able to understand it from the light or from the outside. He will be able to discern exactly what the internal Torah is from what the appearances of the external Torah. The only other man who was able to do it while he was alive was Rabbi Akiva ben Yosef, who actually reached the level of the 50th gate. And he understood the methodology of how to take it out of the external Torah. But Rabbi Akiva ben Yosef died, and he never really gave it over fully, but he did give it over to Klal Yisrael. That's right. On a certain level, Rabbi Akiva ben Yosef, who was the only Mashiach who reached the 50th gate, and who Moshe was jealous of, and he saw that he was beyond him. He was the only one who had the 50th gate, and he understood the methodology, how to derive the 50th gate from the 49th gate, which covers it. And he did give it to Klal Yisrael, but he told the people he gave it to, especially his student, Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, to hide it as a mashal, as a metaphor. And he told Rabbi Shimon not to reveal it in terms of its things. So therefore, it's now in the form of Kabbalah. Kabbalah is the 50th gate of Torah, hidden in the metaphors. And from the metaphors and symbols in which it's written, we have no idea what it is. So Rabbi Shimon successfully hid it, even though now it's much more exposed than it was before and so on. But now it's only exposed to the extent that it's contained now within metaphors. It's now finally out of the Torah. It is. The Kabbalah is a separate limud of what this 50th gate is. When Moshe broke the tablets and he inserted the internal Torah into the external Torah, it was buried in the external Torah. But no one knew how to take it out of the external Torah. But Rabbi Akiva ben Yosef received the 50th gate, and he took it out of it. So now the Torah is exposed completely. It's even exposed from the 50th gate. But Rabbi Akiva did the same thing that Moshe Rabbeinu did. Just like Moshe Rabbeinu hid the 50th gate, which he himself never knew, into the external Torah that we have, the second tablets, he was never able to take it out of the second tablets until Rabbi Akiva ben Yosef took it out of the second tablets. But he told Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai to expose it, but in a metaphor, in symbols, so no one still can't get it. But at least it's available. So now the 50th gate is completely available to Klal Yisrael. It's available, but it's unknowable. And that's the last Madrega, the 50th gate. The last Mashiach will make it available and knowable. So we see that there are 3 levels to the light of Mashiach. Well, there are really 4 levels. The light of Mashiach, when it first came down to the world, the 50th gate, what happened? It killed the whole human race. It was the emotion of Mashiach as a death trap. That was the first time. The second time, it didn't kill anyone, but it was only broken. It was Moshe Rabbeinu breaking that tablets so that he put the light into the external. So now it's buried in the Torah that we have, but it's buried. No one can take it out, even Moshe Rabbeinu. But Rabbi Akiva ben Yosef is the third version where he was able to take it out. But he took it out, and even though he took it out, it became the Kabbalah, but completely concealed in metaphors and symbols, so no one really understands what it's talking about. And in the end, the Mashiach himself, who presides in the end of time, the fourth level, he is the only one who would reveal the 50th gate totally in the Moshe Mashiach. And at that time, Klal Yisrael completely changed. So therefore, we are seeing the fourth version of the Torah, which is what? Which is actually the Torah that was given to us by Moshe Rabbeinu. In other words, what was the Torah that was given on Matan Torah? It is the Nun Sharabin, is the 50th gate. Well, what does that mean? That means that the intention of God was the Jewish people were supposed to live in the Moshe Mashiach because they all had experienced Chiyas HaMesim already. The Jews all died before Matan Torah, and they became back to life. So they were on the level of Chiyas HaMesim, which we will not see until the final Mashiach comes. But they were already on that level. So therefore, the intention of God was that they should perform the 630 commandments while they had the Moshe Mashiach. Well, what does that mean? The Torah that was given on the 50th gate on Matan Torah didn't have a Mishkan. They didn't. There were no Kabbalahs involved, because Klal Yisrael itself was the base of Mikdash. So therefore, what kind of Torah was that? What does it mean it was 630 mitzvahs? What were the 630 mitzvahs? There were no mitzvahs that had to do with Kabbalahs, because they didn't need a Mishkan, because the Mishkan was only given, the tabernacle was only given because the Jews worshipped the golden calf. But before they worshipped the golden calf, which was when the Torah was being given by God, they didn't yet worship it. So therefore, they could have had the 50th gate. So what is the Torah that looks like in the 50th gate? The truth, we don't know. And that's the greatest mystery of all. What was the Torah when it was given on Matan Torah? It was the 50th gate. But did it have 630 mitzvahs? Yes. But what form did they take? We don't know. We don't know what the tachlis, the avodah of Klal Yisrael was if they would never have worshipped the golden calf, and they would have been zercha to the Moshe Mashiach by Matan Torah. We wouldn't have to wait for human history till the Mashiach finally comes at the end of time near the year 6000. We would have had the Moshe Mashiach then by Matan Torah. But what would be the avodah? What would the Jews have to do? We're not clear. That remains a deep mystery. But what we do know, that the 50th gate transferred on different levels. There were 4 different levels to the 50th gate. And the final level is that we now have the 50th gate. We now have it in the Kabbalah, but hidden totally. That's why when the Vilna Gaon says it's through the learning of Kabbalah that when the Mashiach will come. What does he mean? People learn Kabbalah for the last 2,000 years. Yet the Mashiach hasn't come, because what the Vilna Gaon saw was that it will not come because the Torah now is in the form of metaphors and symbols. Nobody knows really what it means. They can mechanically tell you the properties and the characteristics of the Kabbalah, but they can't tell you what it's referring to really. So the Vilna Gaon means that when the Kabbalah becomes a nimshal, when it truly understands what the Kabbalah is saying, that's when you will have the 50th gate. And that's only at the time of Mashiach itself. So that's the fourth version. The fourth version of Torah is what? Is the version given at Matan Torah, which is equivalent to the Nun Sharabina and so on. So what are the 4 versions that we said? The version of Torah that was given to Adam Rishon before the sin, the version of Torah that was given to Adam Rishon after the sin, the 7 mitzvahs, the version of Torah that was given to the Ovis, which was not yet a mitzvah. They weren't commanded it, but yet they were expected to do it. And finally, the version of Torah that was given at Matan Torah, which is the version equivalent to the 50th gate. So what? So what do we see? We see 4 versions of Torah. Each version would have applied to that generation. But there are 4 more versions, and what are they? Well, the next version is the version of what? So the Jews kept the Torah, and they kept the Taryag mitzvahs so far. they kept the Taryag mitzvahs for what? For the next 1,300 years, until the era of the common era. In other words, what was the common era? The year of zero, according to the Goyim. That was the common era. But basically, except for two exceptions, when the Jews were in the Golus of Bavel and then the Golus of what do you call it, of Persia, then the Jews always were in the land of Israel, right? And they always kept the full Torah with the Beis HaMikdash in the land of Israel. So all the Taryag mitzvahs were applicable, yes. But what happened? The Jews suddenly went into the Golus of Edom, the permanent Golus, and God destroyed the second Beis HaMikdash. He rebuilt the second Beis HaMikdash, the story of Purim, but then he destroyed it. He destroyed it, what? 400 years later. And it remained destroyed for good. The original Beis HaMikdash will never come back. It will come back in a higher form, but it will never have the mitzvahs that it had like this. Because in the Yemos Mashiach, the Jews will really not do so many sins. You really won't have that. So therefore, many of the Kabbalas will not be applicable. The Torah will change. All the holidays will be canceled when the Mashiach comes. Only the holiday of Purim would remain. So therefore, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, Pesach, Shavuos, all of these holidays will be canceled. So that means that the original Torah, the mitzvahs of 630 commandments, which are contained in these holidays, no longer exist. So that means that the Torah will never be the same, really. In other words, when the Torah was, when the God put the Jews in Golus of Edom, of Rome, where Romans exiled the Jews throughout the world, God never doesn't seem to intend to bring back the version of Torah that was given to the Jews at Matan Torah. That's right. So therefore we see a new version is created of Torah that exists by Golus, without a Beis HaMikdash and without the land of Israel, to a large extent. And for the next 2,000 years, we have this kind of version. And that's the version of Torah called Torah Golus. It's the version of Torah which does not have Nevuah. It does not have direct access. It's the version of Torah which now has Chokhmah. Now we have philosophers. We have Talmidei Chachomim. What we have is Tanoim. We have Amoraim. We no longer have Nevi'im. So when Rabbi Akiva says, but we still have Ruach HaKodesh, what Rabbi Akiva meant was that we still have some ability to access information that has nothing to do with inference. It has nothing to do with Chokhmah. There are still tzaddikim who have Ruach HaKodesh, which is somewhat like Nevuah. But Nevuah, nobody has anymore. We do not have the souls that are capable of carrying out Nevuah. That was ended by Purim. You see it. But that's the Torah of Golus. The Torah of Golus that we have now is not a temporary Golus, which is given to us by Babylonia and by Persia and Greece. But now we have a permanent Golus from the land of Edom, the land of Rome. When Rome took over the Jewish people at the turn of the era, the common era, in the year 20 or 30 BCE, it was totally different. We were exiled permanently. The temple was destroyed, never to come back in its real form. We were exiled from the land of Israel, basically. We went to Babylonia and created the Babylonian Talmud and so on. And even in Jerusalem, in Tiberia, when we created the Jerusalem Talmud, all we had was the Talmud. We no longer had the 50th gate. Even in certain ways, we never even had the 50th gate in a hidden form, because the Kabbalah was hidden for 1,300 years. It would not be revealed until the Zohar was published in the 13th century, which I will talk about another time. But everything changed, and the Jewish people went to their lowest level, which is called the Torah in the Surah, in the form of Golus. And that's the fifth level of Torah. But I'm saying that there's actually what? I'm saying that, it's the sixth level. The Torah in Golus is the fifth level. The Torah of the last 2,000 years is the fifth level. What I'm saying is there are 8 levels. What am I talking about? Because something else happened. What's that? It's not only that the Jews were taken away from the patriarch mitzvahs, the 630 commandments. The Jews kept the Torah in Golus. It's true, they didn't have 630 commandments. They had much fewer because they were in permanent exile. They were no longer in the land of Israel, and they no longer had a Beis Hamikdash. But they still had hundreds of mitzvahs. But something else happened that never happened before. And what was that? The Jews the Torah was not taken away from the Jews. When God put the Jews into Golus, he took away the Torah from the Jews. But now God is doing something new. He's taking away the Jews from the Torah. Right. He's doing the other direction. God is not simply confiscating mitzvahs. He's confiscating Jews. Because that was the birth of what? That was the birth of the secular Jew. In the 17th century, there was born the secular Jew, the Reformed, the conservative Jews, the people who had secular Jews, who had nothing to do with Judaism, who are now secular humanists. In other words, the belief in the Torah that the Jews had, which was always the same until the 18th century, the 1700s, the Jews always believed, the majority of Jews always believed that the Torah was given by God on Sinai, except that the Torah, they believed of the Purushim, the Pharisees with the Tanoim. They believed that all 630 mitzvahs were given by God in the Torah, and so on and so forth. They did not believe in the different versions, but there was a certain sect of Jews called the Tzedukim, the Sadducees, the Sadducees. And they believed that there were many mitzvahs that are not true of the Torah. In other words, they were created by mankind, and so on. And they were called Sadducees. But for the first time, there came a Jew who didn't believe at all that the God gave the Torah at all. There never existed really such a Jew. The Jews either were composed of Purushim, the Pharisees, the Tanoim, Amorim, and so on, and the Jews who believed in the Torah from Matan Torah, or the Jews, right? Or the Jews who believed in Matan Torah, but they believed in a different number of mitzvahs and so on, the Tzedukim. But there was never a Jew who never believed in Matan Torah, except in the minority. A small minority of Jews were secular, but very few Jews. But suddenly, in the 1700s, there started to grow a new type of Jew, a Jew who did not believe in Matan Torah at all. He believed that the Torah was written by Moshe Rabbeinu and other people after him. So therefore, the Torah lacked a divinity. It was no longer divine. It was man-made. And that's the formation of Reformed Judaism, conservative Judaism, which fundamentally does not believe that the entire Torah that we have is divine, especially the Reformed Jews and Reconstructionist Jews, all these sects and secular Jews, all these different sects, sect SCTS of Jews do not believe in the divinity of the Torah at all. So this was the first time that God did not take away the mitzvahs from the Jews. He took away the Jews from the mitzvahs. That was a whole new concept. And what is that concept called? That's the Torah called in the tzur, in the form of the tinik shenishba. In other words, there's a certain halacha that if a Jew is captured by the goyim, and he's brought up by the goyim, he does not know any Torah. But he does not know any Torah. Why? Because he never learned Torah. He never had chinuch, because he was brought up by goyim. So that Jew is potter, really. He's an oinus. He's potter, he's an oinus. Even Shabbos, when he doesn't know anything about Shabbos. In all the Jews that were brought up in Russia for the 70 years of communism, from the beginning of 1917 until Gorbachev in 1987 or something like that, they never knew anything about Torah. They barely knew that they were Jewish. So all these people are Tinich and Ishba. And a lot of the Jews that were in America gave up the Torah, you see it, because of the pressure of America and this domination of Reform conservative Judaism. These are all categories of Jews that are called the Tinich and Ishba. They don't know anything about Judaism. So therefore they have no obligation of keeping the mitzvahs. So therefore, the Torah that they do, and whatever they do, they still have to do the Torah between man and man. Yes, the Torah between Adam L'Chaveru, man and man, like Lashon Hara and Resicha and murder and theft. These Jews still have to keep that because that's the Torah that they have. But the Torah between man and God is fundamentally vacated, is depleted. They don't know anything about Shabbos, Kashrus, Nida, or any of these things, Mezuzah, Tefillin, Torah. They know nothing about this. So the whole Torah in the form of Bein Adam L'Makom was depleted and taken away. But that doesn't mean that the Torah was taken away. They have the Torah which qualifies to their level of neshama. They are actually at a totally different level of neshama, of soul, than the Jews before, because they no longer have to do many of the mitzvahs between man and God. They just have to do some of the mitzvahs between man and man, and that's what they're obligated, and so on. So therefore, they have a whole different category of mitzvahs. But that doesn't mean they don't have a Torah. They don't even have a depleted Torah. There's no such thing as a depleted Torah. That's right. There's only a Torah, but a Torah for a different category of soul. So all these people who have much smaller souls in the 17th century, the souls of all Jews were completely depleted. That's right. And these are the Jews called Tinik Shenishba, or really in the category of a Ben Adam. The Jews that kept all the Taryag mitzvahs until then were called an Adam. They were called an Adam. They had a full soul. And even the Jews that did not keep it were still called an Adam, because fundamentally God took away the mitzvahs from the men. So therefore it was not their fault. But the Torah we have now is given to who? To secular Jews, to Reform conservative Jews. You know that the majority of Jews today have nothing to do with the Torah. That's right. Therefore, in today's age, for the last 250 years, we are talking about Jews who are fundamentally called the Ben Adam. They are Tinik Shenishba. What does that mean? They are the last generation of Jews, or seems to be. So therefore, they have the 7th version of the Torah, which is the Torah that was given to the Tinik Shenishba. And that would earn them a certain portion of the world to come. Not the same portion in Olam Haba, the world to come, that's given to the Adam, to the Jew who keeps the whole Torah. Each generation that has less and less of a Torah has a less of a degree of what's given to them in Olam Haba. They are sacrificing the level of Olam Haba, but they still earn a chelik in Olam Haba independently. By their doing mitzvahs, they earn Torah from Olam Haba. But a goy doesn't even earn that Torah. A goy owns his Torah through the Jew. Through the maisim of the Jew of each generation, the Torah, the Olam Haba is created, and then the Goyim have the ability to connect to it. But they don't have the ability to connect to it when they hate Jews, and we'll talk about that later on. But that's what they have. But the Jews in the generation, the 7th version of Torah, which is the version of Torah given to the Tinik Shenishba, which allows them to earn Torah independently by what they do, and it allows them to be guaranteed a Torah. It does. But that guarantee is affected by a different ratio between din and rachamim. Rachamim still allows them to have a guaranteed level of Olam Haba. But it's a new version of Torah. It's called the 7th level, or the Torah of Tinik Shenishba. Now, do we end at 7? No. In my opinion, we have one more version of Torah that was never seen by Klal Yisrael. Klal Yisrael has never seen this Jew, and yet God has created a level of Torah for that Jew. Who am I talking about? You mean there's a Jew beyond the secular Jew? Is that possible? Who is that Jew? What am I talking about? But there is a version of Torah beyond the secular Jew, beyond the Reform and so on. Why? Why do I say that? Because fundamentally when God created the Torah of Klal Yisrael, he gave two blessings to Klal Yisrael. He said Klal Yisrael would be an Am Segula. They would be a special people, a chosen people. Chosen for what? Not that Klal Yisrael, the Jew of the Jewish people, is anything special, but because he keeps the Torah of 630 commandments, and because he can earn Olam Haba, he's called a specific, a unique people, a chosen people, and that's what Am Segula. It refers to the spiritual status of Klal Yisrael as it relates to Olam Haba. But Klal Yisrael has another tachlis. Klal Yisrael is also called a Mamlechet Kahanim. He's also called what? A nation of priests. And what does that mean? Who is he a priest of priests? He's a nation of priests to the world. He is the priestly kingdom that God appointed to affect all of mankind, because all of mankind, even the Goyim, are his brothers. And how would he accomplish that? Because when he is an Am Segula, when he keeps the Torah in its total way, all the Goyim see this, and then they follow him. And they will earn the ability to reside in Olam Haba. They do not have the ability to create Olam Haba. When they were all offered the Torah by Matan Torah and they turned it down, they became a true Goy, a Nochri. In other words, the Goy lost his ability to create Olam Haba, but he retains his ability to reside in Olam Haba if the Jew creates it. So the Jew is independent to Olam Haba. He can actually make it through his mitzvahs. And he can make it down to the last level of Jew, astonishingly. But the Goy cannot make Olam Haba. He has no ability. He is what's called terrestrial man. And he has to wait for the Jew to be able to do that. But how can the Jews do that? Because the Jews have to, how can the Jews become a Mamlechet Kahanim? How can the Jews become a people who the Goyim will follow, who the Goyim will respect? How is that possible? If he's a Mamlechet Kahanim, and how will be a Mamlechet Kahanim? How will it be a kingdom of priests? Because the Jew has to realize that he is not simply a member of the Am Segula. He is an organism. Every Jew is connected to every Jew in his soul. All the souls of all Jews throughout time are connected as an organism. And in an organism, there is no such thing as a stranger. Every cell in the human body knows every other cell, and it's an organism. That's why when you want to give a transplant to the human body as an organism, the body says, I don't want that organ because it doesn't belong to me. It's not my liver. I will only accept my liver. I will not accept a liver. Because an organism knows every member of the organism. There's no such concept as a stranger, and it insists that its own organ belongs to its organism. So God says the Jews are an organism. They are not simply a series of members in a club. They are an organism. They all have a certain tachlis, and that tachlis, that purpose, is to create Olam Haba. That's the purpose of a Jew, because he's guaranteed. And when he creates Olam Haba, he eventually can give Olam Haba even to non-Jews, even to a Nochri. How? Because if the Goyim see what the Jews are, that the way the Jews relate to God and their relationship to God, that they are a holy people, and the Goyim see that the Jews are a unified people, that they're not constantly fighting with each other and at war with each other, but they are at peace. And not only that, there are many mitzvahs which relate. They know how to communicate with each other. They love each other. The Jews are commanded to love each other. Not only are the Jews commanded to love God, and you shall love God, but you have to also love your fellow Jew. And they will see this love of one Jew for another. They will see what's called Achdus. What is Achdus? Achdus means that the Jews are one people. They are an organism, and they're called an Aguda Achas, a single entity. And that's the bracha of a Mamlechet Kahanim. When will the Jews be able to influence the Goyim? When the Goyim see them, that these are a holy people. Because why? They not only worship God, but they love each other. And that's a people who truly connect to God. Because God is their father. And God is the father of an organism, of his family. A family is an organism. these people in the family love each other. They not only respect each other and therefore are like subjects in the kingdom, but they are a mishpacha, they are family in the sense that they love each other. And the goyim will suddenly understand that's what the holy, because God relates to mankind, the zulasoi. How? As a father, not only the king. It's not in Malkeinu. God is not simply the father, the king of mankind. Malkeinu, he's the father of mankind. And then the Jewish people, therefore, as his father, he is what? The Jewish people are an organism. They are a mishpacha. So when the goyim see this, they will understand the holiness of a Jew. But if they don't see this, if the Jews keep on fighting with each other, when the Jews disrespect each other, when they talk lashon hara about each other, when they talk rechilas, when they have sinas chinim, unwanted hatred, when they are jealous with each other, when they compete with each other, when there are no longer mitzvahs of chesed, then the Jews lose the category of mamlech kahanim. And that's extremely dangerous, because when they lose the category of being a mamlech kahanim, they are not protected by God. Because in order to be a kingdom of priests and to affect all the nations of the world, you have to love each other. That's how the world sees you, as a holy people. But the world does not see you as a holy people when you do not respect and you do not love each other. They fail as a mamlech kahanim. So therefore, what God has done, He has caused lashon hara to be spoken about Jews in different ways. You see it. He has taken away the laws of lashon hara from Klal Yisrael. So there was never a sefer, a total sefer, written on the laws of lashon hara for the last 2,000 years. Because since Rabbi Akiva ben Yosef could not be the Mashiach, why? Because of sinas chinim. Because many Jews hate each other. And they are in conflict with each other. God has eliminated the category of Shmiras HaLashon, basically, and He has never allowed anyone to write a complete sefer on Lashon Hara until the Chavetz Chaim, who was the first one that wrote a book on Shmiras HaLashon. Because God has accepted the Jewish people as a nation who has sinas chinam. And it's prevented the writing of a book on that until the Chavetz Chaim. It's because we don't understand. How is it possible that God prevented a book to be written on the laws of lashon hara exclusively? If lashon hara is the most dangerous sin of the Jewish people, because it prevented Rabbi Akiva ben Yosef becoming a Mashiach. How? Because Klal Yisrael is already in the category of being forgiven to some extent on lashon hara. It prevents the Mashiach, but it doesn't prevent the category of guarantee. But now finally there's an eighth category, which has its own category of Jew. And what is that eighth category? A Moisa. What is a Moisa? A Moisa is a Jew who sides with the Goyim. He hates Jews. He's an anti-Semite. And he sides with the Goyim to kill Jews or to rob Jews. He is the one that reports Jews to governments and reports Jews so that they will be enemies of the Goyim. Could you please, I'm asking everyone to please mute their phones so I don't hear this noise. So now there's a new category of Jews. There's a category of Messiah. There's a Jew in the world who not only argues with other Jews, but he actually sees himself as not even a Jew. He sides with the Goyim. He creates problems and troubles of the Jew. And we see this in front of us. We see many Jews in the government who are literally anti-Jewish. They think they're Jewish, but they are enemies of the Jewish people. And the biggest category of those two Jews are what? What is the biggest category? And when we look today in 2022, we are shocked because we see two categories of Jews. In Israel, many Jews are Muslim. Why? Because of what they did in Gush Katif. They sided with the Arabs and they gave the Arabs Gush Katif, Gaza. And in doing so, they threw out 10,000 Jews from Gaza. And many of these Jews went into trailers. They live in trailers. Many of them committed suicide, mental problems and emotional problems. They devastated. How? Because they joined the Arabs in allowing the Arabs to take over Gaza. That's Messiah. So therefore, there was a new category created in Eretz Israel where many of these Jews are Muslim. And also in America, when the Jews voted, what? They voted for the Iran deal. They voted for a president who supported the Iran deal, which fundamentally wants to destroy Israel and develop nuclear weapons to annihilate the Jews. And many Jews voted for a president who completely supported the Iran deal, what's called the JCPOA. So many Jews voted for a president who actually supported the possibility of a Holocaust to the Jews in Israel. Well, what is that? That's Masira. So therefore, we see that the Jews have entered a new category today of Masira. And Chazal and the halach is that a Moisa, somebody who distances himself from being a Jew, and what does he do? He suddenly sides with the enemies of the Jews itself. He becomes a Moisa, and it says, he does not have any position in the world to come. Surely he does not have a guarantee, but he doesn't even have a portion in the world to come because he has dismissed himself from being a Jew. But is that true of Reformed and is that true of Reformed Jews? No, it's not, because Reformed Jews still see each other as brothers. That's right. Even though they don't believe in the divinity of Torah, but they still believe in themselves as an ethnic group. And therefore, that is a certain category of Achdus and Ragod Achas. Even Reform against conservative Jews and Reconstructionists, even though these Jews no longer believed in the divinity of Torah, but they still have an Achdus. They still believe in Judaism. They believe in Judaism as the fundamental sign koinon, the essence of what a Jew is, even if it's not divinely given. And they do see themselves as Jews in a certain level. There's still that concept. But a Moisa is not even that. He's dismissed himself from the Jewish people. And as such, he's become an enemy. So in this generation, in the last couple of years, and so on and so forth, in the last 15 to 20 years, we have seen what? We have seen Moism. Since the year 2000, we have seen Jews becoming Masira. And the majority of Jews in America are in that category, and probably in some way in Israel. So what has God done? He's saying that even though a Moisa, even though a person who's an enemy of the Jews has no chelik in Olam haba, but the power of Torah is so powerful, the power of tshuva, the power of rehabilitation, which is submits to a category that God says, I can even save them. And not only can I save them, how? Not only can I save them in the sense that they'll still get a portion of the world to come, albeit a very small portion, yes, because they are the lowest madrig of all, but they will have a portion where they even guaranteed that portion. Astonishing. And how does God do it? Because how God does it, he makes those people, all those Jews, under the category of Moisa. And how does he do that? Well, you can look at it. When you look at the Israeli government, what do you see? You see an Israeli government that has included the Arabs as part of their government. Well, how's that possible? That's Masira, to allow Jews to be ruled by enemies, by Arabs who are enemies of the Jews, connected to the Muslim Brotherhood. Well, these are not Jews, these are enemies. These are the government of Israel, fundamentally is the government of Masira. Why has God done this? Why has he made the Arabs a part of the Israeli government? Because that's the punishment of Moshe. Since you have become part of the Goyim, I will make the Goyim dominate you, and they will become part of you. The Goyim, the Arabs, will become part of the Israeli government, and the Israeli government would submit to them because they want to retain their coalition. But that's fundamentally where the government of Israel has become Muslim. And you see this in America too, that America has completely turned over to the left and completely abandoned the principles of the Constitution and the principles of the Bill of Rights, and wants to take over everyone, even the Americans or even the Jews, everyone, and completely transform the concept of justice, the concept of chesed, by stealing all the money from the Jews, by taking their money, putting them in poverty through an inflation. So therefore we see a new government in both Israel and America, governments which cater to Masira, And why has God done this? To punish the category of Jews called Moisim, which are the majority of categories in today. Why? Because God still wants to save Jews. There is a level of Torah which can still accommodate the level of these people, and that's what God is doing. So therefore, what do we see from this whole lecture? We see that there's no such thing as a depleted Torah. It doesn't exist. There's only something called the Torah, but there are 8 versions of it, each version being accommodating the level of soul that exists in that generation. And as the Jews descend in Madrega, in level, lower and lower and lower, the Torah descends. God says, I will change the Torah, so suddenly it will become a new version, and it will be able to save in both earning and in both guaranteeing that level of Jew which exists at that time. So now we understand something we never really understood, that God has not abandoned the Jews. He is still with the Jews, but he's with the Jews in each generation. What he appears like to the Jews is different. Every generation, or I should say every piece of generation, all 8 versions of Torah correspond to all the generations in human history of the Jewish people. And it's designed to save them in both earning Olam Haba and in both guaranteeing that. And this is how God has proceeded throughout the generations through the concept of mercy. God's mercy not only allows the Jews to possibly save themselves through tshuva, but he allows the Jews to save themselves through the rehabilitation mitzvahs, through the taryag mitzvahs. He never did that before. He never did that with Adam Rishon and the first generations, even though it was much easier. He's only done that with Matan Torah, and he's done that consistently by adding another 4 versions of Torah to deal with what Jews would become in each set of generations. They would become Jews who are in Golus. They would become Jews who are Tinik Shenishba. They would become Jews who are Moisrim. So to accommodate Jewish people when they descend to the lowest levels, when they will be in Golus, without the Beis Hamikdash or Israel, when they will be so that God will take the Jews away from the Torah, so they will be completely ignorant, like a Tinik Shenishba, a Jew was captured among the Goyim. And finally, even when the Jews become Moisrim, he will attempt to save them. Not all of them, but he will attempt to save them. How? By putting them under the domination of Goyim, and having them suffer from the Goyim like they cause suffering to the Jews themselves. Midah keneged midah, measure for measure. So we suddenly understand history in a different way, that God is doing something meticulously to save his children, the Jewish people, who he wants to save Goyim. But he wants the Goyim to be saved and people who are not Jewish. How? By the Jews becoming a Mamlechas Kahanim, by realizing that they are an organism. And as an organism, the Goyim will see that and suddenly realize what a Jew is. So this is the Shir today. In the Shir relates to Pesach, because Pesach was the beginning of that. In a certain sense, the Torah began to really descend from Pesach on. We acquired the Torah that would be in the time of Mashiach, but we lost it from then on to the Torah of what? The Torah of Matan Torah with the second tablets, the Torah of Golus, the Torah of what? Of the Tinik Shenishba, and the Torah of Masira. Each one of these is another level of Torah which is designed to save the Jews for Olam Haba. And we should be all zoicha that when this ends, we should understand what the Rebbeinu Shem has done and thank him profusely for the chesed that he does, that he never gives up on us. And the one bracha is Yisrael, Afa Pishachoti Yisrael, I will never discharge the Jews from being my children, and I will never discharge even the Goyim, even non-Jews, from being my children. I will attempt to save them all, even though what I will do is radical. I will attempt to save them all. And the ultimate bracha where God says, "V'solachti kadvecha," I will redeem the Jews according to what you, Moshe Rabbeinu, have asked of me. For all time, I will shift them to a new level of Torah that will do the job. And what God says to Moshe Rabbeinu, What do I mean, the Midas Harachim? Midas Harachim has 13 words which indicate 13 levels, so that I can say the Jews, all of them. I shall what? Redeem the Jews. I will have mercy on he who I will have mercy on. And I will have compassion on he who will have compassion. In other words, the Jews will forever. Kal Yisrael would never depart. And as much as the Bonisham wants, the Bonisham is equally wants to save the non-Jews. But he wants to save the non-Jews through the Jews. And this is a very important concept.